I'm calling to order this hearing or roundtable. This is a public roundtable being held by the Committee of the Whole. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, October 8th, 2020. The time is 3:11 in the afternoon. This hearing is being conducted via Zoom video conference broadcast. So this is a virtual hearing. It can be watched by the public, either those who are connected to Zoom or via Council Channel 13 cable television, or the DC Council website, which is www.dccouncil.us. The subject of this hearing is consideration of 4 resolutions submitted by the mayor to confirm nominees to the Historic Preservation Review Board. This is the first of 3 hearings that the Committee of the Whole is having this afternoon. And the hearings are scheduled for different times or immediately following the preceding hearing. We have a single Zoom session for all 3 hearings. The witnesses and nominees are all currently participating as attendees, so you can watch the hearing in real time, but as attendees, you cannot interact. When your panel is up to testify, committee staff will admit you into the interactive portion of the hearing as a participant. After you are admitted, please turn on your camera, but leave yourself muted unless you are speaking. Because all of these hearings, all 3 hearings, are on the same Zoom, and it is difficult to know exactly when each hearing will start, committee staff has asked each witness to be in the Zoom prior to the scheduled start time of the hearing. Please be patient as we move from hearing to hearing. So because the next hearing is scheduled for, I believe, 4 o'clock, probably nobody from that hearing is on this hearing or roundtable, but there are some public witnesses and then the nominees themselves. And presumably everybody's in the, I call it the waiting room. So the subject of this hearing is 4 resolutions. PR23-932, which is entitled Historic Preservation Review Board Alexandra Jones Confirmation Resolution of 2020. The stated purpose of which is to confirm the mayor's nomination of Alexandra Jones as an archaeologist member. The second resolution is PR23-933, entitled the Historic Preservation Review Board Matthew Bell Confirmation Resolution of 2020. The stated purpose is to confirm the nomination of Matthew Bell as an architect member. And then the third resolution is PR23-934, entitled the Historic Preservation Review Board Dr. Sandra Jowers Barber Confirmation Resolution of 2020. The stated purpose of which is to confirm the reappointment of Dr. Jowers Barber as a historian member. And the fourth resolution is PR23-935, entitled the Historic Preservation Review Board Marnique Heath Confirmation Resolution of 2020. The stated purpose of which is to confirm the reappointment of Marnique Heath as an architect member to the Historic Preservation Review Board. All of these resolutions were submitted by the mayor on September 9th, 2020. So we're moving fairly quickly to consider them and to provide the public an opportunity to comment. The Historic Preservation Review Board is the official body of advisors appointed by the mayor to guide the government and public on the preservation of historic buildings and property in the District of Columbia. The board also assists with the implementation of federal preservation programs and the review of federal projects in the district. The purpose of this roundtable is to receive testimony from nominees and public witnesses as to the fitness of these nominees for service on the board. The record in this matter will close at 5 p.m. on October 22nd, 2020. So folks have, I believe that works out to 2 weeks to submit testimony or comments. And if anybody who's participating today wishes to supplement their comments, they have 2 weeks to do so. That is 5 p.m. on October 22nd. There were 3 non-nominees who asked to testify. I will call on each. I don't know if they've all been admitted. Andrea Rosen, who's listed as a public witness, Chris Otten, who's listed as being with DC for Reasonable Development, and Rebecca Miller, who's with the DC Preservation League. I think I'll allow 3 minutes testimony. I think that's what the hearing notice said. I'll be a little flexible there. So why don't we begin with Ms. Rosen, and please, when you are testifying, if you would turn on your camera.
If I know how.
Bottom of the screen, there should be a video.
Okay.
There you are.
Okay. Okay, I'll start. I'm Andrea Rosen. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. As a principal with international architectural firm Perkins Eastman, and before that EE&K, Matthew Bell is something of a master builder in the DC metro area. To quote his bio, Bell has been active throughout the Washington-Baltimore region with projects ranging in scale from waterfronts, new towns and neighborhoods to residential projects, civic and mixed-use buildings, and schools. In this century, Mr. Bell has touched many of the mega projects in DC, either at the helm or indirectly as a principal in his firm. Mr. Bell was intimately involved in the redevelopment of the 25-acre McMillan sand filtration site and park as master planner between 2010 and 2018. Not only did he promote this project before the HPRB repeatedly, Mr. Bell had to satisfy the Historic Preservation Office's boss, DEMPED, which was co-developer of the project, and thus his boss as well. I won't belabor the McMillan saga here, other than to say that HPRB is often the gatekeeper to development, and HPO's and HPRB's summary handling of the site's multifaceted historic preservation protections continues to be a subject of scrutiny. The dispatch of McMillan remains quite divisive and is still the subject of lawsuits. Master planning and mega projects almost always involve the demolition of swaths of urban fabric to make way for new plans, new structures. The HPRB is a deliberative body with a historic preservation mission. It is not simply a design board. Putting a master builder on a preservation board is akin to hiring a fox to guard a hen house. Given the extensive reach of Perkins Eastman, conflicts of interest are likely to arise with some frequency. These should lead to equally frequent recusals. Will Mr. Bell recuse himself to avoid the faintest taint of conflict of interest, and is selecting a member who not infrequently must step back an effective way to run a board? Mr. Bell and his firm enjoy the patronage of the DC government through commissions for schools, libraries, community centers, master plans for privatization of public land. How comfortable will Mr. Bell be saying no to projects in which a district agency, DGS, DEMPED, etc., is the applicant? I am concerned that he is too much an insider with both developers and the development apparatus of our government. As you have heard numerous times, HPO's position under DEMPED damages its ability to function independently. Consequently, the credibility of HPRB suffers. I believe that adding Mr. Bell to the HPRB will further undermine citizens' trust that the board is acting independently and in good faith in executing its obligations.
Thank you, Ms. Rosen. Mr. Otten?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson. My name is Chris Otten. I am rocking my Stop Gentrification shirt on here. So I want to testify today about the nomination of Matthew Bell to the Historic Preservation Review Board. I don't know if I can share what I submitted as testimony. Do you have that before you?
I have a single page statement from you.
It should be 2 pages.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know, can I share that image on the second page?
I don't think that will work.
Okay. All right, so, well, so just to describe it for the record, the second page shows at the top the current DC FBI building. Just below that is the current proposed McMillan Park Medical Office Complex on Parcel 1. This is the grandiose architecture that Mr. Bell supports in crushing McMillan Park with. So while the city, and seemingly the mayor and the Office of Planning and other agents of so-called development want to tear down the FBI building for its brutalist, mundane architecture and stylings, here we see, now for the record, although I guess our attendees can't see it, a massive reproduction 2 times over of that FBI building on the northern parcel of our historic registered McMillan Park. And Mr. Bell went at great length to defend and support this behemoth, concrete behemoth that not only will tower over and enshroud in dark shadow all of the historic assets at the northern end of the site, it will destroy all the view sheds to all of the national monuments downtown, including the Capitol, the Washington Monument, and so on and so forth. I think it goes without saying here that for Mr. Bell, who thinks it's okay to take the ugly cousin of the FBI building and crush it onto open green sites like McMillan Park, does anything need to be said any further? Reject this political nomination for the HPRB. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Otten. Rebecca Miller. And if you would, everybody mute themselves except Ms. Miller.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson. My name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. Thanks for taking the opportunity to listen to our comments today. First off, we'd just like to offer no objection to the reappointments of Ms. Heath and Dr. Jowers-Barber. We did meet with Mr. Bell last Friday, and DCPL has been familiar with Mr. Bell's work for many years. He did provide us with some thoughtful answers to our questions regarding the purpose and intent of the HPRB and the review of projects. He did state that he believed that Preservation Review has improved his projects over the years. He did acknowledge that his understanding of criteria for landmark and district designation is limited, and as we do at each hearing, we encourage you to encourage the Office of Planning and the Historic Preservation Office to provide training to the board members, not only to new board members, but also as a refresher to the current board members. I think that a refresh every time that there's a new batch of nominees that come through, I think is important to the board's consistency when it comes to historic designation. DCPL reached out to Dr. Jones on 2 different occasions, but unfortunately received no response. Having no interactions with her previously, we were unable to take a position. We do have questions about Dr. Jones's qualifications for the board based off of her resume. The HPRB regulations require that a majority of the members are professionals meeting national qualification standards in at least one of the 4 disciplines for history, architectural history, architecture, prehistoric, and historic archaeology. For archaeology, the minimum, while Ms. Jones meets the minimum requirements, we question as to whether or not she meets the qualifications for prehistoric. So in addition to the minimum qualifications for historic archaeology, prehistoric archaeology shall have at least 1 year of full-time professional experience as a supervisory level in the study of archaeological resources of the prehistoric period. There was no indication on her CV as to whether or not she had this qualification or not. If she does not have this qualification, then another archaeologist would be required to be appointed to the board. And given that we have 4 nominees here, we don't actually have a 5th seat to offer. One other thing that I hope that the chairman will cover today with these appointees would be the attendance of the board and making sure that that there are not conflicts of interest, as was discussed by the previous panelists. Also, the attendance in the past year and a half or so, it's actually gotten better while we've been on Zoom calls, but in person, it was actually pretty deplorable during the 2019. We had multiple hearings where there was not a quorum. That's not fair to the public. It's not fair to the applicants. And especially when you may have a quorum when you start the day and you don't have a quorum when you end the day. So people have sat there all day waiting for their opportunity to speak before the board, and they either can't get a vote, or the members of the public that are there to testify are told, well, the board members will watch it later and then we'll take a vote next time. It just seems to be a really inadequate way to run a board that has so much power with regards to the development in this city. Also, with regards to attendance, it's also about the consistency of review that's important. Just this last week, there was a project in LeDroit Park that went back before the board. The board member who was not there in June came and made and pushed back on the project that had been quasi-approved in June, and now the developers have to go back and do more work. There is a lot of pushback from the community on this particular project, and so it's forcing the developer to go back and meet with the community association and the ANC, which is great. But this was not, we're talking June to October at this point, before they were told that they need to go back for a smaller project. And that's just because there was different board members who were present at each hearing. And so we want to see consistency. We want to make sure that there's a quorum on the board so that these projects can move forward. Historic preservation has a lot of pressure on it all the time because of the development pressures around the city, and anything that we can do to facilitate good projects moving forward in a timely manner helps the preservation movement as a whole. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing the statements of the nominees. Thank you.
Thank you, each of you. I have a couple questions, and then I'm going to turn to the nominees. This may sound a little unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Ms. Rosen, Mr. Otten, how much of your opposition to Mr. Bell is because he's involved with the McMillan project and you are opposed to the McMillan project?
Oopsie.
That's sort of how this is coming across.
I realized that was a real possibility, but one of the reasons I'm opposed to the McMillan project is because of, I mean, it's hard to say it's a chicken and an egg situation. I knew nothing about Mr. Bell until I started attending HPRB hearings on McMillan, and furthermore attended a National Capital Planning Commission hearing at which he spoke, and it shook my faith in, well, in architects generally, actually. I also think, just in an abstract way, someone whose bread and butter is large-scale planning is not necessarily temperamentally sort of attuned or sympathetic to preservation. It's just my opinion. I mean, I think it makes sense.
Thank you. Mr. Otten?
I'm going to echo Ms. Rosen's points. I mean, Mr. Bell has a track record we can look at as it regards, historic preservation in a major project. I mean, McMillan Park is a nationally registered historic site. Beyond that, it has an historic preservation covenant completely overlooked by, so far, seemingly everybody in the city, including Mr. Bell. I don't know, Mr. Mendelson, why you think it's okay to build the ugly cousin of the FBI building on McMillan Park, but certainly somebody with some astute understanding of basic preservation principles would never support a gigantic building on an open green space, some of the last of it along North Capitol Street, the size and the look of the FBI building, which everybody seems to be clamoring to want to tear down. So I think we're looking at a track record here. Yes, I am opposed to the demolition of an historic site with a giant FBI-like building, but it is the presentations and the absolute support of that by Mr. Bell that proves a track record that he cannot determine these things well. Am I coming through?
I'm understanding you. Let me move on to, I have some other questions. Thank you. Ms. Miller, we don't have a copy of your statement.
I'm having a
And at the moment, your Zoom transmission isn't working. And I want to be able to ask you questions. And you're frozen. Are you back?
I'm back. Sorry. I'm having a few technical challenges today. So I will send you a copy of my statement once I'm able to pull it off our server.
Okay. Thank you for coming back after that freeze there. Could you explain again the concern about the archaeologist member?
So the Historic Preservation Review Board regulations require that the archaeologist, well, you can have 2 archaeologists, or you can have 1 who is certified in prehistoric and historic archaeology. What we don't know from Dr. Jones's CV is whether or not she is certified in prehistoric archaeology. And since she didn't respond to our request for a meeting, we were unable to ask her that question. So perhaps the chairman could quiz her on that when she makes her testimony. Because that is of concern, because we have a 9-member board. We will, if all of these members are approved, we will have 9 members, but we will be shy a prehistoric archaeologist if Dr. Jones does not meet that requirement.
Did I understand you to say that there could be 2 positions, 2 archaeologists?
There could be 2 archaeologists, yes.
But there aren't.
There are not. We have in the past had 1 archaeologist who is certified in both prehistoric and historic.
So it could be 2 archaeologists or 1, but the 1 has to be certified in both historic and prehistoric.
That is correct.
Okay. And do you know why Ms. Jones didn't meet with you?
I do not.
She didn't give you an explanation. Did she respond?
There was no response. There was no response to my emails.
Okay. And do you know that you had the correct email address?
We used the email address that was based off of her current employer, so at Goucher College.
Okay. Can you speak to us about Mr. Bell? So he would be a new appointment. And
Yes.
DCPL was able to interview him?
We were, yes. And
Now-
we have met with Mr. Bell on a number of occasions in the past where he has presented before our project review committee that does testify before the Historic Preservation Review Board almost monthly.
For Ms. Jowers-Barber and for Ms. Heath, DCPL has no objection to their reappointment.
We don't.
Your position on Mr. Bell?
We are not opposed to him, no.
Okay.
We did discuss with him the conflict of interest and also his time that he has to spend on this. We are very familiar with how much time the board members need to spend on reviewing these projects. And he assured us that he does in fact have the time, that he has the team around him who is taking on the projects at the firm. And he's teaching part-time at Maryland. So,
What's your understanding of the time?
the time constraints on this, well, this is based off of what I've been told by previous board members where they receive their packets of information. They have time to review these. Many of them go and visit the sites so that they can review those as well. I believe it's as much time as you're interested in putting into it. But as an architect member of the board and doing design review, I believe it probably takes more time than, say, reviewing a landmark nomination.
And why were you satisfied with the conflict of interest issue?
Well, he is not going to be working on, he said he would recuse himself in the cases where his firm obviously would be working or he had some kind of interaction. Obviously, Macmillan keeps going before the board for different aspects of that particular site development. He would need to recuse himself from that as well. But that also draws into my later statement about attendance and consistency of review and quorums is, are there going to be so many projects going forward that the DC government is doing that Mr. Bell's firm may be bidding for or may be looking to work on in the future that he has to recuse himself because of that relationship? I mean, I guess that's a question. If he's doing a lot of work with DGS, whether the requirement of, if he's, he was building a school and DGS is the client and DGS is then before the HPRB, is the question of, is that a conflict? So that's, I think, something that Mr. Bell would need to answer with regards to any questions you have as well.
Okay, let me see if I have any other questions for you. You had mentioned training in your statement. Is the training by the Office of Planning, in your view, adequate?
If it's applied. So there have been in the past, the National Register, obviously the National Park Service is in DC, the National Register is here, and the reviewers have in the past come and offered the opportunity for the board members to have this training. And I think it should continue. I mean, I do trust the National Park Service. They are, the foremost experts when it comes to historic properties. It's all about application though. And, obviously there are some cases where we disagree with the board and many cases where we agree with them.
The last time you came before this committee, I believe, or I recall, that you were concerned about some members who were using extraneous arguments outside of the historic preservation law to
Yes.
opine and presumably decide cases. Are you still seeing that as an issue? And maybe you could explain that a little better than I just did.
Well, our previous issue, when you had two nominees that were before you last summer, one of which was not moved forward, who had been making a number of assertions that were outside of their purview on the board that didn't have anything to do with the criteria. There are cases where board members have made statements that don't have to do with the criteria that's set forth within the law. Many times the board will correct them. So that is very helpful to have such a very capable staff at HPO who can then help guide the conversation back to the criteria for designation.
So an example of something that would be outside the criteria would be?
Owner opposition, or I don't think that it's important enough because it doesn't, making I statements of, I don't think it's important enough because it didn't happen, or I'm the same age as that. How about that? That's a decent, we're getting into things that are now mid-century buildings, and some of the board members may be of that age. And some of them many people don't like to think about themselves aging, and they say, oh gosh, that building was built after I was born. It can't be historic. That's not a criteria. The criteria is whether or not it meets history, archaeology, something important. So architecture. And those criteria are set forth in the law. And we make the argument for those particular criteria. And if they don't think that we've made our argument, then that's perfectly fine. But it's when it goes outside of things such as, if the owner's opposed to this, that's not one of the criteria for designation in the District of Columbia.
Thank you. So I think my only concluding question for you is you will send, and it's actually a statement, you'll send us a copy of your statement.
I will, yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to excuse each of you, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Otten, and Ms. Miller, and call the nominees now. You don't have to leave the attendance room. I don't think I'll be asking any of you to come back, but you might stick around just in case. So let me call the four nominees. Dr. Alexandra Jones, Matthew Bell, Dr. Sandra Chowers-Barber, and Marnie Keith. I believe everybody's present. What I'm going to do is ask each of you to give your statement. I understand each of you has a statement, and then I'll have some questions for you. And I'm going to follow the order that I have on the witness list here. So Dr. Jones, you would be first, and then Mr. Bell.
Okay, good afternoon,
Good
Chairman
afternoon.
Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Alexandra Jones, a Ward 5 resident, and I want to thank you for allowing me to testify here today. I would also like to thank Mayor Bowser for nominating me to serve on the Historic Preservation Review Board. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a native Washingtonian. I attended St. John's College High School and Howard University, where I obtained my first 3 degrees. I continued my education at University of California, Berkeley for my second master's and my PhD in anthropology, specializing in archaeology. I returned home to DC and founded a nonprofit organization called Archaeology in the Community with the desire to teach children in the DMV about archaeology. I have over 18 years of experience as an educator. I've taught in multiple educational environments, from DCPS schools as a substitute teacher, to museums like the Reginald F. Lewis and the African American History, Culture, and African American Civil War Museum. I've taught at colleges such as Howard University, the University of California, Berkeley, and Baltimore City Community College. And I've also taught on digital platforms such as Archaeology in the Community's Dig Archaeology video series. I've worked for PBS TV show Time Team America as an archaeology field school director, where I directed field schools for junior high and high school students at each one of our sites, which did include 2 prehistoric sites in addition to 2 historic sites. And currently I'm a visiting professor at Goucher College and an adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore. I am a registered professional archaeologist. I've conducted numerous excavations in places which mostly focus on the African diaspora, including several sites in Maryland, Jamaica, and currently I'm working in St. Croix, US Virgin Islands. I currently serve on the board of directors for the Society of Black Archaeologists. The organization's mission is to promote academic excellence and social responsibility by creating space for Black archaeologists and other scholars who support SBA's goals and activities. I'm also the newly appointed member of the St. Croix Archaeological Society, which is an organization dedicated to the education of youth, residents of St. Croix, and visitors about prehistoric, pre-contact history of the island of St. Croix. In addition, I serve on the advisory board for the Josiah Henson Museum and Park in Montgomery County, Maryland, and on the editorial board for the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage. I am also a member of numerous professional archaeology organizations, the Society of Black Archaeologists, the Archaeological Society of Maryland, the Council of Maryland Archaeology, St. Croix Archaeological Society, and the Society for Historical Archaeology, on which I serve on the Gender and Minority Affairs Committee. As a native Washingtonian, this nomination is an honor, offering an opportunity to serve for the district, for which has given me so much to me and shaped me to the person I am today. I would like to again thank the mayor for this nomination and for the members of the council for the opportunity to address you today. And I would be glad to answer any questions that you may have, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. I will have some questions for each of you. Mr. Bell, you're next, followed by Dr. Chowers-Barber. Mr. Bell, you're going to have to start over because you're muted.
How's that? Okay.
Yes, I saw a lot of passion, but I didn't hear anything.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Matthew Bell. a Ward 3 resident, and I'd like to thank you for allowing me to testify here today. I would also like to thank Mayor Bowser for nominating me to serve as a member of the Historic Preservation Review Board. I have lived in the district since 1983, except for a period of 4 years studying and teaching at Cornell University. I raised my children here, sent them to DC public schools, and have been engaged in the profession of architecture in private practice and teaching as a tenured full professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Maryland since 1989. I have practiced architecture with several firms in the district, and my current affiliation is as principal at Perkins Eastman, DC. I have served as president of the Neighborhood Design Center in Baltimore and Prince George's County, Maryland, assisting lower income communities and community groups in matters of urban design, architecture, and planning. From 1994 to 99, I was the director and conference chair of the Northeast Regional Meeting of the Mayor's Institute for City Design, sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts, and I have served as a juror for the International Biennale of Venice, Italy in 2006. I'm a member of Ward 3 Vision, a group dedicated to bringing smart growth to Ward 3 in our city. I'm a registered architect, and in 2013, I was elevated to the designation of Fellow in the American Institute of Architects. My professional work has received awards from the American Institute of Architects, the Congress for the New Urbanism, the United States Green Building Council, the Urban Land Institute, and the Committee of 100 on the Federal City, to name a few. My work at Perkins Eastman ranges in scale from waterfronts, new towns, and neighborhoods to residential projects, civic and mixed-use buildings, and schools. In the city, I've been responsible for projects ranging from master plans, such as the city's plan for Upper Georgia Avenue, the Foggy Bottom Campus Plan for George Washington University, the initial master plan for the Nats Stadium District, the Hill East Reservation 13 plan, and master plan and community center for the McMillan site on North Capitol Street. My building projects have included the modernized Stoddard Elementary School and Community Center, School Without Walls, Dunbar and Roosevelt High Schools, and the recently completed Cleveland Park Library. Several of these projects were either modernizations or additions to landmark buildings, historic sites themselves, or on sites located in historic districts. My current projects include master plans and building projects for American University and Catholic University, along with mixed-use projects that comprise residential, retail, and open space development. I have also sought to support public discourse and design, working with colleagues at the AIA to develop exhibitions focused on the architecture and urban design of our city, such as Revision, new projects in Washington, D.C. in 2015, featuring the 5 biggest projects in Washington: the Wharf, the Yards, Burnham Place, Capitol Crossing, and McMillan, and the 2018 exhibition Rebirth, Washington, D.C., 50 years after 1968. I have had the great fortune of practicing and teaching architecture and urban design in our great city, and I'm proud of the positive impact our projects have made to improve schools, neighborhoods, public places, and public facilities. Frequently, our projects have had the benefit of reviews by the HPRB, and those encounters have surfaced important design issues for our projects, resulting in greater resolution and compatibility with the historic settings in which they reside. It would be a great honor for me to contribute to that dialogue and serve our community's interest and well-being on the HPRB. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Dr. Jowers-Barber, and you'll be followed by Ms. Heath.
Bill Wilson.
Dr. Jowers-Barber, you're muted.
I apologize.
Don't
Good
apologize.
afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the council. I am Dr. Sandra Jowers-Barber, and I thank you for holding this hearing today. I wish to thank Mayor Bowser for renominating me to the Historic Preservation Review Board and the council for its consideration of my renomination to this very important position. I continue to reside in Ward 4 in Northwest DC and have been a district resident now for 50 years. I am a public and oral historian and an educator with an interest in historic preservation for over 15 years. I have a doctorate in U.S. history and a master's degree in public history from Howard University. I am the chair of the Humanities and Criminology Division at the University of the District of Columbia Community College in Washington, D.C. My research focuses on documenting the history of marginalized voices, especially those of the African American deaf community in the district. Identifying, documenting, and preserving or commemorating physical spaces that minority populations inhabited is important in incorporating that history into the larger narrative of the history of Washington, D.C. and American history as a whole. I take seriously the responsibility of serving on this board. I believe that I have done so with integrity, intelligence, transparency, and fairness. As a historian, I understand the importance of documenting historical actors, events, and locations. Physical primary sources and buildings and spaces that fit that definition can and should be used to teach, educate, and expose citizens to contributions made by and with those sources. Seeing and hearing the passion and commitment of residents seeking to preserve historic sites in their communities has been uplifting. The reality of communities not always united as to the need for that preservation has been informative. My continuation as a member of the Historic Preservation Review Board will combine my training as a public historian, experience as an educator, and desire to serve. Mr. Chairman and council members, I thank you for your time and request that you confirm my reappointment to the Historic Preservation Review Board, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jowers-Barber. And Marnique Heath. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Marnique Heath, and I thank you for holding this hearing today. I wish to thank Mayor Bowser for nominating me for reappointment to the Historic Preservation Review Board and the Council for its consideration of my reappointment to this very important position, even in the midst of a pandemic. I'm a resident of Ward 3 in Northwest Washington, D.C., and have been a district resident for about 20 years. I've been practicing architecture for 22 years, and I hold an architectural license in the district. I'm a principal in the Washington, D.C. office of Studios Architecture, an international design firm specializing in workplace, civic and institutional, and mixed-use projects. At Studios, I oversee an innovative design practice with a diverse client base, including the district and federal government, law practices and financial firms, foreign entities, educational and nonprofit institutions, and a myriad of corporations. During my 22 years at Studios, my practice has involved leadership on complex projects that integrate sustainability and historic preservation. I first became interested in historic preservation while working on the renovation of the headquarters for the American Institute of Architects, a modern era building designed in the 1970s and sited directly behind the historic Octagon House. While the AIA headquarters is not designated as historic, we were charged with developing a renovation strategy that did not preclude the building from designation in the future, and that was respectful of the historic Octagon House. Due to the level of innovation proposed, the design process involved numerous presentations to community groups and district agencies, including the Commission of Fine Arts, the Office of Planning, the Office of Historic Preservation, and the Zoning Commission. The redesign of the mid-century modern building outlined a strategy for the headquarters to achieve LEED Platinum designation and carbon neutrality by the year 2030. The project was also positioned to be a national demonstration project to show how a sustainable design approach can be applied to existing energy hog office buildings. In addition to my years of experience and leadership on projects involving historic preservation, I am also uniquely qualified to serve on the HPRB due to my years of service on the Board of Zoning Adjustment in DC. I began my service as a member of the BZA in February 2014, and from October 2015 to September 2016, which was the conclusion of my term, I served as chair of that board. During my time as board chair of BZA, I experienced firsthand the importance of an open dialogue among all stakeholders in order to achieve practical and reasonable solutions that are in the best interest of the community and the district. I've found that experience to be quite valuable during my tenure as chair of HPRB. As a member of the board, my view on historic preservation has been and will continue to be focused on thoughtful interpretation of the historic preservation design guidelines while carefully considering the practical and functional aspects of a project. I've been proactive in helping to better realign the board's sustainability guidelines to help reduce the district's reliance on fossil fuels while still being thoughtful about historic preservation. I'm also continuing to work with the Historic Preservation Office on several initiatives to provide the board with training to make us a more effective body. To this end, we've added an executive session to our agenda each month where HPO staff and board members can discuss some of the complexities of certain cases to better prepare the board for hearings. Prior to COVID, we were organizing neighborhood tours and half-day training sessions. We plan to resume these efforts once again, once it's safe. I look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with the Office of Planning, the Office of Historic Preservation, DC Preservation League, the Historical Society of DC, local ANCs, and other district stakeholders to advance the preservation, sustainability, and thoughtful development of our neighborhoods and communities. Mr. Chairman and council members, thank you for your time this afternoon and request that you confirm my reappointment to the Historic Preservation Review Board. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Heath. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony. I was just getting a note from staff. I wanted to make sure that if the record is closing on the 22nd of October, I think that's what I said, that we're not creating a problem because I believe you, Ms. Heath, and Ms. Dr. Jowers-Barber, your terms have technically expired, so you're in a holdover status. But my understanding is your terms expired July 21st?
I think that's correct.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yes.
Okay. So there doesn't seem to be an issue if we don't act this month, if we act next month. Ms. Heath, let me ask you, because you're the chair of the HPRB currently.
I am.
How much time does it take for a member? Now, you probably as chair to spend more time, but for an average member, roughly how much time does it take?
Typically, because we've got such a full docket, we receive our materials now digitally on Friday. And typically, I spend a good portion of the weekend. I may split it between 2 days, but a good portion of the weekend going through cases to familiarize myself with all of the issues and reading the various reports. We also receive additional information usually by that Wednesday. Our board meetings are on Thursdays, so that Wednesday we receive additional information. And so Wednesday evenings, I spend time going through new materials that have come in. Our board meetings, are all day. And so it also requires of board members that we be available throughout the duration of a day. It's rare, but sometimes they're shorter. But we do ask that board members set aside that day and the following Thursday for continuation meetings when those happen.
And the following Thursday is a full day as well?
Often, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's shorter, but we ask that board members hold that entire day as well.
So as much as 2 Thursdays, half a weekend, and a Wednesday evening every month?
Correct.
And I asked that in part to understand, but also because now I'm going to ask each of the nominees if you have the time and ability to serve, knowing what the time commitment is. So, Ms. Heath, I'm not going to assume your answer is yes. Do you have that time and ability to spend that time?
Yes.
And Dr. Jones?
Yes.
And I can't tell if you're, yes, you're, I'm not in gallery view. Mr. Bell?
Yes, sir.
And Dr. Sandra Jowers-Barber?
Yes, I have the time.
Let me also ask, I always ask these 3 questions at hearings. I think it was in the pre-hearing questions, and I haven't had a chance to look at them, but I believe I've gotten responses from each of you. Are you current in your taxes and obligations to the district government and federal government? I'll begin with Dr. Jones.
Yes.
Mr. Bell?
Yes.
Dr. Jowers-Barber?
Yes.
And Ms. Heath?
Yes.
The 3rd question I always ask is about conflict of interest. And I think the way I'll ask this is, Dr. Jones, are you aware of any conflict of interest that you might have that might come up while you're serving on the board?
No.
Mr. Bell?
I believe my conflict of interest would be limited to clients I have that I'm working for, or clients that we currently are working for, or projects that we're doing at Perkins Eastman, or projects that I'm doing at Perkins Eastman. I would recuse myself under those circumstances.
Would there be occasion when you might be in doubt whether there would be a conflict?
Well, I would do my best to discuss with colleagues if I have any questions, either the chair, I would seek some help from Marnique, or I would seek clarification from Steve Calcott as well. And I will, being new on the board, I would be asking a lot of questions about that, but I certainly would err on the side of clarity to seek guidance on that.
So you were present when Ms. Rosen was giving her testimony. She said conflicts of interest are likely to arise with some frequency. I guess because DGS or the government or DEMPED are sometimes your client?
They have been, yes. We are working for DGS right now, yes.
Do you think that would happen often?
I think it would happen often. I'm not sure I could say. I think there would be probably circumstances where I would have to recuse myself with one of their projects.
Dr. Jowers-Barber?
No, I don't imagine any conflicts that would occur.
In the time that you have been on the board, have there been occasions when a conflict of interest came up and you had to recuse yourself?
I do not remember ever having to recuse myself.
Ms. Heath?
It's been very rare for me. I recently had a case that came before the board where my firm and I were the architect for the applicant before the board. And so I recused myself. It's for me, it's particularly important that I make the staff and other board members aware immediately upon seeing that a case is coming before the board, so that I can have somebody step in to take over as chair, but it's happened just once recently. it's been very rare.
And as chair of the board, so you are paying attention to this more than other members. Does the process of identifying a conflict of interest and then recusal, is it a fairly smooth process? Staff understands it, members understand it?
Yes, and as members of the board, Mr. Bell and Ms. Jones would be made aware of what constitutes a conflict of interest and when to bring that. I mean, immediately upon seeing the agenda, that's the time to bring that to the chair and staff's attention. The board members are diligent about that, sending us emails in advance so we're aware.
Let me see, I have some specific questions, but I'm going to ask a very general question of each of you. I'm trying to think of the right order. If I ask the veterans, you'll help the newbies. If I start with the newbies, they don't have the advantage of the veterans. So we'll see where I start on this. And that is, what do you consider are the benefits of historic preservation, particularly in the context of the district? And how do we balance the needs of a growing city with historic preservation interests? Let me see. I think I'll start with Mr. Bell.
Well, I think the benefits of historic preservation should be obvious to all, but I think from my point of view, we are blessed to live in a city with extraordinary historic patrimony, and we are the guardians of that patrimony into the future so that future generations can enjoy the aesthetic benefits of it and see the built form of our history, you know, and the reality of that. So I think it's an essential part of being a good steward of history and a good steward of our environment. I think so that was the first part you asked me about the importance of preservation. It's essential, and I think it's the city and citizenry benefits extraordinary from it. The second part of your question was again about
Balancing the needs with a growing city.
the city is always growing, and I think you have to really look to the compatibility of a proposal with how the landmark has been articulated in terms of its characteristics to understand that. I think historic districts can grow, they should grow, they are going to change. The purpose of the board is to make sure that whatever is being proposed has the compatibility and addresses compatibility with the landmark so that proper decisions can be made. You know, each of these are in case-by-case basis. You know, I've been part of projects that were large master plan areas and individual buildings where changes have been proposed. And I think having a thorough public vetting of those things and different points of views offered is very, very important part of that process. The city is never frozen in amber, but I think my experience has been that the board has given very good guidance to make projects better. And I think will continue to do so in the future. And its role is very important so that these landmarks, whether they be a district or an individual building, can be continue to grow, and they can continue to offer the kind of special characteristics that they do in terms of our architectural and historic patrimony. You know, I think you're always looking at ways of balancing those things, but also having a clear sense of what is compatible and what is not.
Thank you. Ms. Heath, the same question. What do you consider the benefits of historic preservation, particularly in the context of the district, and how do you balance the needs of a growing city with historic preservation interests?
Sure. I think that, you know, historic preservation in the district is particularly important given the both the aesthetic quality of the architecture that exists here, but also the rich history and culture of the place and the people who have been here throughout the history of the district. I've particularly enjoyed being a part of cases recently where we were designating parts of the city like Kingman Park, where you have a history of people that is often not told. and a history of people that is often lost because preservation in underserved communities often doesn't happen. And so to me, particularly in the district where there's such a rich history and culture of people, preservation has been very important to helping to continue to tell those stories and to allow people who come after us to be able to know and understand the significance of the people and places that existed. I think that, you know, preservation certainly isn't in conflict with the development that happens as a part of a growing city, which is evidenced by the number of applications that we have coming before us all the time. I think that as a board, we've worked really well with applicants to help advance issues such as affordable housing, sustainability, helping communities to grow in a way that still preserves some of the historic fabric, but allows new development and growth to happen around that and in a way that's complementary to that historic fabric. And so I think that growth can certainly happen in the context of historic preservation.
Thank you. And Ms. Jones, what do you consider the benefits of historic preservation, particularly in the context of the district, and how do you balance the needs of a growing city with historic preservation interests?
So I feel like a group of people are nothing without their history or their past. And being a native Washingtonian, I very much believe in that and believe in looking at the history and the heritage that all of us native Washingtonians have created in this region. So with that being said, just in the past 15 years, the city has completely flipped. What it was 15 years ago and what it is are completely different. But I don't necessarily always see that as a bad thing. What I do see is that you need people who are very, very centered around preservation and preservation of past and stories of numerous communities and different people. And in that, you need creativity and ingenuity, meaning that we can have both at the same time. We can create spaces that do offer affordable housing, that are sustainable, while also educating the future generations about the history and the past and the landscape in which we all really love. And so for me, I think this is an opportunity where the knowledge base that we have, when it comes down to making a determination, if it does require going back to the drawing board, using the creativity that we have as a board can offer some suggestions of how that can be done in a way which is very much giving honor to and venerating the people who built this great city.
Thank you. Dr. Jowers-Barber.
Thank you. When I was writing my comments, I wanted to make sure I emphasize that preservation is used to teach, educate, and expose citizens to contributions made by and with those sources. It is so important that our citizens and those who are residents, those who are coming, understand and have a way of knowing what has been done, what has been built by individuals here, and honoring that. And preservation is a way of doing that honoring, as well as teaching and providing opportunities for new residents and for older residents to understand the struggle that people had, to understand the challenges they had, and the skills they had. So preservation is so key in those three areas. And that's why it's always a joy when I see communities come before the board that know their history, want to preserve it, and are willing to fight and articulate why it's important that it's a historical district. Or even if it's in opposition, why it's important that that history be preserved. The balance is definitely there. Being on this board has allowed me to see in real time how you can balance growth and preservation. you have to have dedicated individuals who have vision, who are willing to work with applicants within the guidelines, but work with applicants and make sure that you have that kind of growth without overshadowing or taking away from the history that is there, whether it's a building, whether it's a site, and you have to be aware that it's more than just a building. And I think that's the job of the board, to certainly follow those guidelines, but understand preservation is about people as well.
Thank you. So let me ask another general question of each of you, and that is the role of community input. So the board meetings are open and they invite community public testimony. You heard earlier some testimony prior to the four of you about how community support, I think actually what they said was owner support or opposition, is outside the criteria. So can you say, each of you say a little bit more about what your view is on the community, role of the community? I'll start with Ms. Heath.
Sure. I'll clarify, and I believe this is what Ms. Miller was referring to when she said that community input or owner input is outside of the criteria, specifically regarding designations. If an owner of a property that is nominated for designation objects to that, that is not criteria for denying that nomination. And so we face all the time cases where either an owner or community member opposes the designation. Designation criteria is very strict.
You just muted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Very strict, and then we
yes.
lost you.
So the criteria is very strict, and so as much as we listen to what the community has to say, the only way that they can provide reason for us to object to that designation is to prove that the project does not meet, based on the application, does not meet the criteria for designation. It can't be that they just don't want it to be designated, or they don't agree that it should be historic. With respect to an application that comes before us for a project that's proposed within a historic district or that is landmarked, we do give great weight to ANCs. And so that's a way of allowing the community to have a strong voice in the determination of the outcome of a hearing. That doesn't mean that we have to agree with what the ANC says, but we at least have to acknowledge the ANC's comments and speak directly to why they did or did not provide persuasive advice for the board in our determination. We do often, I mean, we as a board, I think, are very respectful of the fact that getting community input is important. And in fact, we have asked an applicant to come back to us in rare cases where an applicant has not met with the ANC or has not spoken to the community. I think that it's very important and a part of the process that an applicant should go through in order to get community buy-in. It doesn't always happen. And so in those cases where there's opposition, then it's our job as a board to determine what is reasonable objection and or reasonable points made by the community, and to determine whether we should ask the applicant if they're within if they're applicable to the guidelines for historic preservation, ask the applicant to either consider or reconsider something that they're proposing. But I do think that community participation in the process is very important, and the board has stressed that.
Thank you. Dr. Jowers-Barber?
That is key. One of the things that happens far too often in underrepresented communities or communities where the history was not always thought worthy is that people felt that they weren't heard and there was no audience for them, that something just was done to their community without them having the opportunity to articulate either whether they were for it or against it or why they were. And I think the board, I believe, when we have those community members come in, no matter what the community is, but allow that space and that opportunity to articulate the importance and significance of their community, I think that is key to what preservation is all about. Because while it certainly is about preserving a structure or a site for future generations, it's also about the generation that's there and how it's important to them and allowing them to be respected and have a voice in it. So that has been some of the most uplifting points for me, is to have the opportunity to listen to community members who many times would say they never had anyone ask them about how they felt about their community or what was going into their community. And for this to be a place where they could do that, and for this board to give them that opportunity. So that's one of the benefits for me, to be able to have the opportunity to listen to people and know that we've given them that space. It may not always agree, it may go the other way, but there was a time and a space where they were heard.
Thank you. Dr. Jones?
So I wholeheartedly agree with everything that everybody has said so far. I'm a community archaeologist, which means by nature, I work with multiple stakeholders when coming up with a project plan, with coming up with preservation, with coming up with how we're going to retell the story and honor the story. So I think it's extremely important to have community views, to be heard. Oftentimes it has effects in ways that we never expected. And I do have one situation where I know something was put before the Preservation Board in the state of Maryland, and the developer was building, and the developer actually offered afterwards. They agreed to do it, but they offered afterwards to create memorial signs because the community was so passionate about it. So I do know that the power that communities being heard in these forums have, and how important it is to feel seen and heard, especially in this day and age when a lot of people do not feel like either one of those are happening.
And Mr. Bell?
Well, just briefly, you know, clearly the great weight of the ANC plays a role in any deliberative process with the HPRB. And I'm fully believe that you can learn a lot by listening and just hearing what people are saying. But I also think it's got to be a two-way conversation, that it's incumbent upon the board and the leadership of the board to explain to the community what the role of the board is and what it isn't. And to be very clear about that, that there may be 10 things that a community has to say about a project, but only a smaller number may fall under the purview of the Historic Preservation Review Board in terms of things that the board is tasked with deciding and reviewing. So I think that sort of dialogue is really key, so people can have an honest kind of exchange about what the board's obligation is in terms of, you know, rendering a decision about the compatibility of a design or a landmark or a designation, whatever it is, and the community understanding what those limitations are. And I think it's very important that, you know, that people be given the chance to talk about that, and you have that dialogue so that both they can understand and we can understand more about what their objections are. And I think that in my experience, that sort of dialogue has really, when it goes well, it helps people understand both what preservation is about and also what communities value.
But Dr. Jowers-Barber, because you went on about how important it is for the community to be heard, you're not suggesting that the board go outside the criteria, for instance, in landmarking.
I'm not suggesting they go outside the criteria. I am saying that the opportunity when we have hearings for the community to come in and express their concerns is critical. And that's, for me, a key part of preservation, where you hear what the community has to say. And like I said at the closing of my comments, it does not always, you're not changing because of that. If the application meets the criteria, it meets the criteria. However, I'm talking about many times communities, and as Chairman Heath said, sometimes applicants don't ask, don't get the community's input, and that's problematic, right? So I think that it's critical that communities have the opportunity to respond, and it could be that they're in agreement with it, but just have that space to come in and the respect given to the community that they are informed and told what's going on. No, I'm not suggesting at all that you change the criteria or go outside the criteria. I'm just simply saying that part of what the Historic Preservation Review Board should be doing is making sure that those communities have a space to comment on what is taking place in their community.
Thank you, and that's helpful. I appreciate that. I have a few more very specific questions. Ms. Heath, you're currently the chair. I quickly looked at the nomination. I think the mayor has to designate you as chair, doesn't she?
She does, yes.
Do you know what her intention is, or does she need to redesignate you?
I have not heard that she has to redesignate me. I'm not exactly sure how that process works. My understanding, though, is that it's her desire for me to continue as chair based on my conversations with her staff.
Yeah. Maybe we will follow up with the Mayor's Office of Appointments.
Sure.
And maybe you should check with HPO staff just so that we're doing this correctly.
Sure, absolutely, I will.
I just pulled that out and then I didn't look at it. Yeah, the resolution just simply would confirm the appointment.
Okay,
It says appointment, but it would be reappointment.
right.
So we should double check that.
Okay.
Dr. Jones, there was a question raised about whether you are a credentialed in prehistoric archaeology.
Yes, so I ran a archaeological lab for 1.5 years. It's actually on my CV, the Veterans Curation Archaeological Lab, where I managed the collections for the Army Corps of Engineers. And all of their sites were prehistoric sites. So I managed all of their archives as well as the artifacts that went along with all of those sites while training veterans to do that as well. In addition to that, my board position is for a prehistoric society in St. Croix. So that's why in explaining the mission of that, it only looks at pre-Columbian archaeology on the island of St. Croix.
So you believe you meet the requirements?
Yes.
And I have to say, I don't know. We're talking about the difference between credentials in historic archaeology versus prehistoric archaeology. This is not my expertise.
No worries. So just to give you a little bit of background for us, generally it means that you have to work in a site or do work with. So because I've been working with, and I was in the supervisory role as the lab manager and director for the archaeological collections, that in itself gives me the supervisory role that I think Ms. Miller was referring to. In addition to that, I'm on the board of an actual archaeological society that only oversees pre-Columbian archaeology and educates people on pre-Columbian archaeology on the island.
Would you double check with HPO staff to make sure that there's not an issue there?
Sure.
Also, the Preservation League said they reached out to you and they've not been able to meet with you. Do you know what that's about?
So I don't know, because my email is on the top of my CV, which if they have a copy of my CV, it actually shows my Gmail account, which is my personal account. So if they were doing it to the college, I'm also new to the college.
Well,
So
this is how it gets circulated, so.
okay. So yeah, they did it to the college. It probably got lost. We're in the middle of COVID, being honest. So there's lots of emails, and it could have easily gotten lost or thrown into spam. I'm not that proficient at checking that one. I normally go to my personal. Everything's been coming through my personal.
Would you commit to meeting with the Preservation League in the next couple of weeks?
Sure.
And if there needs to be an exchange of email addresses, my office will help in that regard.
Okay.
I'm not going to ask you to say over this Zoom platform what your address is.
Thank you.
And Dr. Jowers-Barber, I had a question for you about attendance. What I do with appointments is I try to check with staff to find attendance records. I have a couple more confirmation hearings today, and I've done this there as well. Last year, your attendance was not very good. Should that be of concern to me?
No, one of the things that's happened this year with, and I don't want to say it's a positive thing, but with the technology, it's made it easier. I had a couple of issues because we were setting up a new curriculum at the college, and it pulled me away because I had some mandatory meetings. I don't have that this time because everything has been set up. So there will not be that kind of challenge with having a attendance or having to leave early to make a meeting. So that will not be a problem.
Okay, that's good to hear that it won't be a problem going forward. I don't think I have any other questions for any of you. Let me actually just double check with staff. Hold on a moment. I think I've exhausted myself with questions, so I appreciate your time. Those of you who've been on the board, I want to thank you for your service. And for all four of you, I want to thank you for your willingness to serve. And with that, again, the record will close in 2 weeks. So if there's anything else you want to submit, you have until 5 p.m. on October 22nd. What I'm going to do in a half a minute is I will gavel and adjourn this hearing. And then, and you all can leave. And then I will pause a minute or two and then start the next hearing. So with that, the time is 4:33 in the afternoon and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Mendel.